Hello, in this lecture, we're talking about the Roman Empire. And the points that we'll cover are the rule of Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar emerges victorious in the end of the destruction, at the end of the destruction of the Republic that we talked about last time. He restores order and sets Rome on a different trajectory. We'll talk about the Pax Romana, and we'll talk about the transformation of the Roman Empire. Here is a bust and picture of Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar, as we learned, was part of the second triumvirate, but with his triumvirate partners, he parted ways, they became rivals, and in a series of wars fought not just on the Italian peninsula, but in Egypt and other places in the Roman Empire. He defeated his enemies, finally Mark Antony and Cleopatra, famously at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Mark Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide, and Augustus returned to Rome uncontested. We look to his name at the time was Octavian, and he changed his name and took on the name of Augustus Caesar. He goes down in history as having a very successful reign. Through his longevity, his command over the army, and his manipulation of political symbols and language that masked his power, Augustus succeeded in restoring political stability to Rome. He also transformed Republican Rome into imperial Rome. Let me say a little bit more about that. He assumes the title princeps, which is an acknowledgement that something's different. But princeps meant the first man of the principate. So this is the principate is the Roman political system invented by Augustus. It is a disguised monarchy in which the princeps, the first man, is the emperor. He takes the title Augustus Caesar. He rules from 27 BCE to 14 CE. In the East, even during his lifetime, he is seen as a god, an emperor. But on the Italian peninsula, hearkening back to these century-old traditions that started in the 500s when the patrician class of Rome overthrew the Etruscan monarchy, the Etruscan monarchs, there was a deep-rooted aversion to a monarchy. Remember, many senators acceded to the violent murder of Caesar based on a fear that he would call himself king. He called himself dictator for life. We'd seen some dictators before, but so that the idea of kingship and monarchy was an idea that sat very poorly with Romans because of the story it had been telling itself for centuries. Nonetheless, the Rome that Augustus Caesar ruled over remained a republic in name only. This is one-man rule. I think the record shows he was in large part up to the task, but it meant he did an awful lot of that work. Here, just to switch pictures of him. Here's another bust of Augustus, and we'll talk about sculpture, but notice the very idealized, smooth skin for all the hours that he's putting in. And to pull off what he pulled off, he had to put in a lot of hours. And you can contrast it to this bust from a coin of Caesar down in the corner that didn't hide the wrinkles and the care in his face. And so here we see some aesthetic differences between the reign of Julius Caesar and sculpture as it manifested under Augustus Caesar. What are his goals? His goals are to restore stability. We've seen years of fighting in the streets, in distant battles, tension, conflict, violence. He wants to restore stability. He wants to restore order, and he wants to restore legitimacy. Part of the problem is that Rome saw too many people in the century's last republic claiming legitimacy without having sufficient buy-in to have a peaceful, productive tenure. So Augustus restores the trappings of republic, but the reality is one-man rule. How does he do it? Well, basically, he assumes all the jobs. He is consul. He is tribune. He is, and he is this new title he creates, the princeps. And the princeps controls other appointments. So we see more and more roles in government are not elected, they're appointed. And even as the institutions remain that continue to present that vision of shared power, representative power, separation of powers, the one man, Augustus, occupies so many of these roles. So his authority is unchecked by that separation of powers concept that obtained for so long in the Roman Republic, and that is one of the foundational principles of the Republic of the United States of America. So how does he go about this? Well, he uses a combination of hardball tactics and softball tactics. His hardball tactics include he keeps control of the army. He institutes a number of reforms. He moves from having a citizen militia, where people are called up, they go on campaign, they'd return to their farms. Of course, we'd seen that model be chipped away over the years till the army doesn't even necessarily have a have that property owning requirement. And Augustus says, we'll have this reform, no more standing militia. We'll have a full-time standing army. This is your career for decades, and you'll move all around the empire, and there's no, none of this on-season, off-season type of life. And the army, as we talked about in the Praetorium, doesn't just come into the city, and troops don't walk the streets. Only the Praetorian Guard in Rome, they protect the princeps, and they also do policing. They walk the cities of Rome, but not the army. Augustus creates colonies of retired soldiers. He establishes about 40 different colonies across the Roman Empire, and whereas soldiers and returning generals had created such problems in the past, this gets them out of the way, out of the center, and provides a life for them. Meanwhile, being these people that have been honed in the Roman army for their whole career, settled in some far province, they contribute to a process of Romanization. Augustus also reduces the size of the army. He lessened the expenditures, and he also reduces the eye towards expansion. He contributed to building the limes. We'll see pictures of those. Augustus accepted the Rhine River as the extent of the empire. His successors won't keep to that. Rome will continue to expand. But there was this practical view of the limits of Roman capabilities and resources, as opposed to some megalomaniacal desire to expand endlessly. And keep in mind, one of the benefits of expanding new territories is the booty that one could gain on taking a territory. And so there's a recognition of the booty one gained at first pass was often tempered by the expenses of trying to keep control of an area. So that's a few words about the army. Augustus also, he initiates provincial administrative reforms. He recognizes that corruption is a major problem. It has contributed to the instability of previous decades. And so he makes the following reforms. One, we're going to pay salaries. If you don't pay people to do a certain job, then how can you expect them to not fleece the people underneath them? And if the people underneath them are fleeced too much, this foments unrest. People will only take so much. So there is this sense, we will pay salaries and you will be expected to not fleece the people. He institutes merit hires. So it's not so to move away from nepotism, who you know, who you're related to, and say, based on your service and demonstrated competencies, you will be assigned this. Since Augustus, so this is an HR, a human resources challenge, Augustus is willing to do that work. And so he is this practice of merit hires works for helping to reestablish stability across the empire and through the imperial bureaucracy. He does other things to improve the bureaucracy. And granted, Rome has a catch-22. The bureaucracy is too small to govern this large empire effectively, but at the same time, it's too big to kind of be subject to sound oversight. Augustus greatly reduced corruption and the exploitation that had flourished in the late Republic by creating well-paid civil service, open to all classes. Not perfect. Is there still corruption? Yes. Do people still get ahead through their connections? Yes. But it's an improvement on what had been. Augustus also implements law reforms. He creates a profession dedicated to jurisprudence. He formalizes in writing different law codes, a citizen law, law of various peoples. And one of the things that we see manifesting in Augustus's written law codes is this innovation that intent matters. What is in your heart and what your intentions are significant in determining how guilty or innocent one is in a crime. It's why in the United States of America, this is a remnant that we still see present in our legal system. It's the difference between homicide 1 and manslaughter. In both cases, a life ends. The charge of murder means that there was intent, that it has been determined there was intent to kill, whereas manslaughter can be, this was ending a life accidentally. And it's different. When we're going to talk next time more about religion. So what's different here is that the Romans, they never cared what you believed in your heart, so long as you showed up and performed the rituals to the gods of the state. That's what mattered. There's no inquisition to make sure that you have the right belief. That's coming. We'll talk about the Christian Inquisition. We'll talk about that attempt to know what's in one's heart. Romans didn't care about that. You show up, be at the ritual, we're good to go. Here, this innovation in law is starting to show an interest in the state kind of turning its attention to the inner, to knowing the heart of its citizens. So those are some of the hardball tactics that Augustus took. He also advanced his goals of restoring stability, order, and legitimacy through a number of softball tactics. Of course, some of those, and that many of these softball tactics took place through a very hard medium, marble and stone. Here I wanted to just point out, this is a statue of Augustus, the Augustus of Prima Porta, which was probably a replica of a statue in the home of his wife. And I recommend to you to watch Han Academy video analyzing this statue with all of its symbolism. In his breastplated vest, he associates himself with the favor of the Roman gods and reminds people of his victory in battles. And with the little baby riding a dolphin down at his feet, Cupid riding a dolphin, he associates himself with the Greek gods themselves. We'll see more of that as the empire proceeds. He invests in a great amount of building projects. On his deathbed, he is said to have said, "I found a Rome of bricks, I leave to you one of marble." And he may have had a slightly different meaning, but he did a lot to build up great monuments of Rome. He didn't build the Colosseum, that comes later, but he built a number of fine monuments, public spaces, a forum, some of which, well, the remnants of which still remain. Now, other soft touch approaches. Through legislation and propaganda, Augustus sought with some success to check the moral and social decline and revive old Roman ideals and traditions. There was a palpable perception by contemporaries that there was a need for this. The poet Horace wrote a verse that kind of demonstrates that when he wrote, "Time corrupts all, what has it not made worse? Our grandfathers sired feebler children, theirs were weaker still, ourselves and nor our curse must be to breed even more degenerate heirs." So right there, we see this motif of the once upon a time, things were better, things were great, and things are getting worse. Kids used to be tougher and better behaved and more respectful to their parents, whose parents, walked to school uphill in the snow, uphill both ways, as opposed to today's spoiled youth. You've heard these, no doubt, yourself. And so I think one of the tasks for the historian is to try and tease out, is this just something people say all the time, or to what extent do generations and ages change? Certainly in terms of sexual mores, we see things don't move just in one direction. And Augustus is part of that, trying to re-establish order. They're living in a sense that things have decayed from the state of political institutions to the state of individual morality, and a restoration is in order. So Augustus works to reestablish the integrity of the family. He does this by legislating against adultery, which was at the time the chief grounds for divorce. And as the Republic was unraveling, divorce was fairly common. This is in modern society, you can see people referencing the rate of divorce as an example of how society is getting worse, until someone points out, well, there's more divorce now because a century ago, women didn't have the same financial autonomy that they have now. So maybe we had less divorce, but maybe we had even more abuse in marriage or unhappy marriages, right? So the fact itself of more divorce, depending on the context, may or may not indicate the conclusion some people might draw. At any rate, back to Rome. He makes it hard, legislates against adultery. A permanent court was set up to prosecute adulterous wives and their lovers. Among those found guilty and banished from Rome were actually his own daughter and granddaughter. And finally, yeah, he put his money where his mouth was on that one. Well, anyway, that's a higher level Roman history course. And finally, to disarm the gangs that had been terrorizing cities, he outlawed the carrying of daggers in the city. This had once been for some source of pride, but in Augustus's view of things, it led to too much violence. It was going. Augustus propagated his legitimacy through coins, through building projects, which I mentioned. He said that Sculpture, as we also saw, I showed you, sculpture became more idealized, and the early Roman world weary Caesar that I showed you, in a culture that had celebrated the old, there was a reason he was shown with all that wear and care and wrinkles. But now instead we're going to see more of a celebration of idealized youthful strength, kind of drawing from the those idealized Greek statues celebrating the human form. Augustus also, here is the the Augustus Forum that he sponsored to the various gods. Augustus also sponsored a system of state, kind of literature, you might say propaganda. This picture right here is this picture right here is a picture of Virgil, who is the author of the epic poem, the Aeneid. The Aeneid is Rome's version of the Odyssey, just as so the Roman gods mapped with the Greek gods, and there was this cultural taking. We can see Virgil's Aeneid as that sort of Odyssey for Romans. And what you have here in the bottom, you see a map that charts the travels of this famous Trojan that ends up being part of a Roman legacy. And up there, a 3rd century mosaic image of Virgil, the author, holding a manuscript of the Aeneid, surrounded by the muses Clio, the muse of history, and Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, on either side of him. So that is an example of his soft touch. We will build a Roman state that we can be proud of, with literature and traditions to make us proud as Romans. Note, however, rhetoric falls off the map because there's no more room in this society for open debate. I haven't told you yet that our great orator Cicero was murdered, probably at the hands of Mark Antony, and even his he was murdered at the hands of Mark Antony. The new Roman Empire is not a place that celebrates powerful rhetoric, and Augustus worked to find other types of literature and oral written expression to celebrate. So Livy, Horace, Aeneas, Ovid are all celebrated authors until Ovid was actually exiled to a chilly Black Sea, perhaps having been found out, having been involved in a scandal with Augustus's granddaughter Julia, who was also exiled. Or there's one interpretation that perhaps Ovid had made remarks suggesting Augustus's own misdeeds. And then finally, another soft power thing, we see this dance with deification. Yes, in the East, he's already in his lifetime being somewhat deified, not so much back in Rome, but what happens is after an emperor passes away, we'll see them more actively associated with gods. Again, this draws from a Roman tradition. Part of that belief system of even Republican Rome was honoring the ancestors of the family, honoring the dead in one's own family. And so we can kind of see it isn't a big leap to come to a place where this hyper celebration and association with gods of the first citizen, the princeps, the first man of the principate. So the reign of Augustus initiates the Pax Romana, and this is generally timed from the rule of Augustus Caesar to the end of the emperorship of Marcus Aurelius. And the Pax Romana initiates a time of relative peace, open trade and communication, and a time when things are good for a lot of Roman citizens. Here is a picture of the expanding Roman Empire. The medium green is the extent of the empire at Augustus's death. And we see the famed network of Roman roads throughout the Roman Empire. And we see this map here shows us, again, kind of outlines and different products that are grown. It is not, however, it is not all a happy, it's not a happy story for everyone. The Roman Tacitus wrote, "They make a desert and call it peace," is how the Roman historian Tacitus, quoting a Caledonian chieftain, Calgacus, who rebelled against Rome, a speech that he had made. This map of England shows the numerous campaigns that the Roman military went on in England in order to subdue crowds there that did not want to be subject to the Roman emperor. So for them, it wasn't so much a Pax Romana. Down here, the picture is an 18th century oak engraving from England, recalling the Boudica of an English tribe who led an uprising against Rome in the 60s. So that is just to put on the Pax Romana. Let's not put too rosy of a veneer on it. And we see even in this age some of the problems brewing, but we'll leave those for now and come to those later. It's easy to identify problems with the hindsight of history, and even as some of those roots are present and have been throughout our look at Roman history, this is considered a pretty good time. Also, here is a picture of Tacitus that I thought I would show, this Roman orator, senator, historian who said many, many pithy things. We could talk a long time about quotes of Tacitus, and I thought that he, among other things, wrote, "It is the rare fortune of these days that one may think what one likes and say what one thinks." That's his take on the time he's living in, and maybe hearkening back to that, to my remark about rhetoric is gone, and one can live well, but there are limits to critiquing the state. One of the things that Rome needs to do in this time is bound itself. Or not that it needs to, but there's this recognition of how far can we go? This was probably that "I will go to the ends of the earth" was a sentiment that probably contributed to Alexander the Great's men mutinying on him in India, if you'll recall. And so Augustus certainly had a sense of infinite expansion isn't the way to go. He recognized not the Rhine, but Danube as a limit of the Roman extension, although his successors would go farther. But Rome started to bound its empire with the limes. So it looks like limes, but it's pronounced limes. And this was sometimes used as a district, but generally meant a boundary line or a marker. And so the Roman army, one of the things they would do, they built roads, and then they would also build these walls. And sometimes they're actual walls, as you see here, but otherwise they were kind of ditches and ramparts to kind of keep barbarian armies from coming in. Certainly, you could build a ditch that a horse would definitely impede the passage of cavalry. So and so that was done, and it could be depending on the materials present. You'd have to dig a lot of ditches, a whole lot of manpower, but not necessarily assemble a fence. And so there's a variety of ways in which the limes were constructed. We do see in the century of the Roman empires that they that they're built in various places. Out there in England, you had Hadrian's Wall being built. I showed you a picture of that. And then at other places in the empire where there's particular challenges from outsiders. The outsiders that we're going to focus on most when we talk about the transformation will be those Germanic barbarians up in the north. Those are kind of the limes, Rome thinking about its own end. Its own territorial extent, rather, not its chronological end. So, the Pax Romana. So, a good amount of good times, we might say. It's not good everywhere. There's uprisings being put down in England, over around the Black Sea. We also have challenges to Roman hegemony campaigns that are fought in the Middle East. In Jerusalem, we'll see the Roman-Jewish War. So, and many, those that were defeated might have been killed, they might have been enslaved, and many Romans themselves, even in this time of the Pax Romana, see in Rome's imperialism a complete abandonment of the Roman republican values that they thought had made Rome great, if you will. Whatever criticism by republican-minded citizens and whatever political troubles or wayward emperors, and boy, there are some wayward emperors, the problem of one-man rule, when you don't get a good ruler, those problems are tremendously exacerbated and people suffer. This period did see an unprecedented level of socioeconomic stability that fostered trade and fostered cultural contact within the empire and beyond it. A period of relative peace. It's the longest period of relative peace in Western history, some say. We see it's a period of economic prosperity. This restoring stability at the center went a long way in helping achieve that. Rome's unification of the ancient world had far-reaching economic consequences. It was, the Pax Romana was responsible for the elimination of tolls and a number of artificial barriers, the suppression of piracy and lawlessness, and the establishment of a reliable coinage. Such factors, along with this durable relative peace, explain in large measure the greatest expansion of commerce that occurred in the first and second centuries of the Common Era. Industry was also stimulated, but its expansion was limited since wealth remained concentrated and there was no mass market for industrialized goods. That's centuries away. Industry was organized on the small shop basis, the bread maker, and various types of artisans. Producers were widely scattered about and generally worked in self-sufficient ways that later economists would contrast to efficiency. The economy of the empire, it remained basically agricultural. And one thing we do see happening is these huge estates, these latifundia, they prospered. And on these tracts, usually belonging to absentee owners who were probably, many of them in Rome, kind of working as best they could, their political advantage, appointments, etc. And on these estates with their absentee owners, you had large number of coloni, free tenants. They tilled the soil basically as sharecroppers or tenant farmers even. And these coloni began replacing slave labor. While the empire was expanding more rapidly, they are constantly bringing back booty of enslaved peoples, and those enslaved peoples are going to work on the big estates and some other public work projects perhaps. But as expansion ceases, these disenfranchised, once upon a time landowner perhaps, or others, they start to do that labor. And these are, it's becoming increasingly hard to secure labor because there's a disappearance of a flow of war captains. So those are kind of some general remarks. Here I'm going to go through some slides really quickly without much emphasis on kind of ruler to ruler. This isn't the kind of history I necessarily like to do, but just to kind of give us a sense. Some of you have heard some of these names, and we have with Augustus, he is from a line that's called the Julio-Claudian emperors, and they were, it's sort of a dynasty, but this isn't a bloodline dynasty here. We have adoption, and sort of this, the emperor picks the person he thinks is going to do best. The Senate approves him, maintaining those fictions of a representative government, and it passes on. In this batch of Julio-Claudian emperors, we really have some figures like Caligula and Nero, who have given historians and historical filmmakers in Hollywood a lot of material to work with. They provide some examples of how much damage a bad ruler can do, and some of the excesses that get tolerated when one is sitting at the very top of the hierarchy. And we'll talk more about Nero and his persecution of Christians, an excess by someone at the top of the hierarchy that resulted in much death and suffering. The Julio-Claudian emperors were followed by the Flavian dynasty. Here we actually do have a father and two sons in Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. I won't say a lot about these, but just to kind of point to other events that happened in their reign in this first century of CE, the Common Era. And now you'll note, now we're counting up. No more BCE, CE. You won't really see that in my dates because we're counting up. We haven't brought Jesus into our story yet, although initially that changing of the calendar turns on him. People in this time period or in the first century aren't yet counting like this, but nonetheless, we will, to try and make sense of a chronology. At any rate, it's under Vespasian that we have the first Jewish-Roman war from a great revolt by Jews in Jerusalem. The Roman army comes. We see the destruction of the Second Temple, the siege of Masada. There's another movie that's been made about that, more than one. Back in Rome, the one of the most famous symbols of ancient Rome, the Colosseum, is finished under his son. It is on his son Titus's watch that Mount Vesuvius erupts in the year 79. And there is, from a fresco in Pompeii, actually, the god Bacchus with Vesuvius in the background. The Pax Romana is rounded out what's known as the 5 good emperors. This, again, is not a bloodline, and I'll never really ask you to know these people. Again, these slides are just for you to have some kind of data points in your sense of what are some of the rulers of the Roman Empire. Maybe is something to know is that Trajan, an emperor who is actually probably born on the Iberian Peninsula and doesn't live in Rome, it is under him that the empire reaches its greatest territorial extent, a very celebrated reign, sufficiently stable and long. A length of reign is often good for stability. He also participates in devaluing the currency, something we'll talk more about. And we'll talk a little bit more about Marcus Aurelius, whose son Commodus is a bit of a piece of work for all his dad's fine philosophy. But he was very much a kind of philosopher in power, something a philosopher in power. Edward Gibbon, an 18th century historian who wrote one of the most famous account books, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 18th century 6-volume collection. If you ever have insomnia, don't read this because it actually is a pretty, it's a page turner. He really writes with a sense of drama about the moment in ways that present day scholars might poo-poo. But I share with you this quote from Gibbon, characterizing this period. He says, "If a man were called upon to fix that period in history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the deaths of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. What he's naming the period we call the Pax Romana. So historians still, they chip away very much at this notion of a Pax Romana. I took some moments to say, hey, it's not all that good. It's not good if you don't like Roman rule and want to be your own sovereign power. But nonetheless, that title, Pax Romana, remains for us. Here's another slide kind of showing you more marble busts of dead Romans. Now, I just want to make one point. So back in the city, though I've talked a little bit about the extent of the empire, back in the city, we have what's become normal in Rome are massive public works projects, and also a massive dole. And that is kind of giving out bread to people that don't have work, don't have sufficient work. And so this, when we look at what happened to Rome now, it's something to be aware of, that Rome is increasingly populous. The state provides food aid, essentially. And people that have little means, they know that. So it kind of drives a little bit of a consolidation to this big city. Of course, in big cities, there's also jobs that people can do. But one of the lessons of the destruction of the Republic had been how dangerous it could be to have mass mobilization of disenfranchised people. And so under the Roman Empire, it is a state priority to provide free food. Maybe 250,000 recipients getting food even for their families. So that might have been, historians wonder if maybe more than 700,000 people get food, get free food from the state. We don't really know the population, but it is significant. It's a significant number of people. And so the state, to maintain this goal of stability, which had been such a premium fundamental goal for Augustus, one of the things the state does is it provides that food aid. It also provides entertainment. Give people something to do so they don't cause trouble. So we see circuses, we see a big hippodrome where races are held that people can go and watch. We see betting, we see gladiator events that are dramatic and exciting. Sometimes people really die, often. And so gladiator events, and then there's other holidays that are spent. In all, in ancient Rome, by 200 or so, you have about 100 days a year where some sort of public entertainment is on display. And one Juvenal, who was a kind of writer and a little bit wry critic, in his satire wrote the following about that. He said, "Already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil office, legions, everything now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things, bread and circuses." And this is where this phrase you might have heard, give people bread and a circus. Juvenal thought it was a troubling dynamic in society. It's also been said that in our own modern culture, we have the equivalent of the bread and circus is Fox News and Walmart, and a constant entertainment in the television that really stimulates and angers people and gives them something to fear, as exciting perhaps as a gladiatorial combat. And then meanwhile, we have a system where people can buy cheap plastic things at Walmart. They might break, they might be bad for your health, but there's that kind of consumer satisfaction that is delivered. So some have made the comparison that, Fox News or constant entertainment and Walmart are the 20th century, 21st century American equivalents to the bread in a circus. And people might talk about and think about what that means for society and what that means for society, where society is going. If we were Hegelians, we would think history is going in one particular direction. And if we just can find and pay attention to the right indicators, we can know where we're located in history. That's a somewhat passé idea, and now historians were more inclined to think about contingency and the agency of individuals as driving the future in directions that no one can know for sure. Even though we see patterns repeat and dynamics repeat, we don't have a sense that history repeats itself. I live in a generation that is more inclined to accept contingency as something we need to appreciate in terms of understanding how history moves. Now, so the Pax Romana, all is not well, and I'm gonna again be super quick here. In the 3rd century, we start to see crises. The empire doesn't even hold together entirely. This map shows you that the Gallic Roman Empire in the 3rd century, it breaks off and exists. The same thing with the Palmyrene in the southeast part of the empire. A big problem is currency debasement. This is something Trajan did. He's not the only one. That less and less real precious metal is going into the money. This graph here shows, it may not be entirely correct, but it's sort of general trend, less and less silver content is in the money. Here is another graph indicating if the blue indicates silver and the orange indicates other metals. Here is 27 BCE, where you have more than 90% of a coin is made out of silver, and by 300 CE, it's reverse. So this leads to problems, inflation. People don't trust the currency, so that economic stability that stretched across the emperor and facilitated what we call the Pax Romana gives way when you don't really have a working money system. So to skip ahead, Diocletian, who rules from 282 to 305, he is a ruler, for whatever we'll say about him, he recognizes that the empire's got problems. We've got to do things differently. And he determines it's too big. He creates something called the Tetrarchy, where he divides the Roman Empire into 2 different empires, with one capital in Rome, and Rome will sort of preside over the western part of the empire, where some linguistic differences have emerged. People speak Latin, or what will become Romance languages, but in this part of the empire, there's more Latin speaking. And the eastern part of the empire, which is going to be based in Constantinople, Constantinople will be the metropole from which the eastern part of the empire is administered. And this part of the empire, we have more Greek speakers. So that we start to see the east-west divide. It is politically determined at first, but it plays off along some linguistic divides. We're going to see more cultural divides and more religious divides as well. Now what Diocletian does, he actually divides the empire into 4 bits, with kind of 2 different emperors and then a co-ruler with 4 different places. This statue up is 4 leaders symbolizing the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy lasts only from 293 to 313. It's an interesting political experiment. I mean, how often in history do you see people cede power, walk away from power? The generalization that tends to hold true is people with power seek more power, power corrupts. It isn't something that people cede willingly. But Diocletian does see a problem, and he makes this move to separate power, where previous empires had thought the solution is in centralizing power, perhaps, and sometimes that works fairly well. He says it's unrealistic. We've got to have 2 different centers to govern. The Tetrarchy doesn't last, but this divide into 2 empires, east and west, will. Tremendously significant. We'll talk more about that. as our course proceeds. Here's another image with some dates and kind of can help you visualize that. Now, there's so far in all of this, I haven't talked about barbarians, those Germanic peoples that are very much a part of explaining how the Roman Empire declines, falls, is transformed. All these terms have been applied. And I haven't talked at all about Christianity. And there's a really important story here of how Rome moves from a pagan to a Christian empire. And so we have here Marcus Aurelius sacrificing to the Roman gods, this philosopher emperor, to a painting of Christians being persecuted under Nero, to this 9th century Byzantine manuscript capturing the Emperor Constantine's vision before the Battle of at the Milvian Bridge, which is going to lead to the end of persecution. So next time we will talk more about the emergence and rise of Christianity in Rome as Rome moves from a pagan to a Christian empire.